Dead by Daylight, a game of cat and mouse, a deadly competition where four survivors must work together to escape the clutches of a relentless killer. But as the entity looms, so does the question that has haunted the community for years. Is Dead by Daylight killer-sided or survivor-sided? Hello friends, today we're going to be talking about one of the most debated topics in all of the Dead by Daylight community. We will be looking at escape rates, kill rates, meta shifts, and how perks have changed the game over the years and continually reshaped how it's played. Since its release in 2016, Dead by Daylight has been a unique asymmetric multiplayer experience. One killer and four survivors. But the balance in a game like this isn't as simple as a 50-50 win rate. In the early days, survivors had strong tools like pallet loops, flashlight saves, and infamous perks like Decisive Strike and Self-Care. Killers often struggled, leading many to believe the game was survivor-sided. But the meta is never static. Over the years, Behavior Interactive has released over 30 chapters, each introducing new killers, survivors, and perks that shift the game's power dynamics. Perks like Ruin, Corrupt Intervention, Pop Goes the Weasel gave killers much-needed control. Meanwhile, survivors had perks like Dead Hard, Borrowed Time, and Iron Will to dominate the meta. But each perk meta sparked its own controversy. The 2022 meta shakeup rework adjusted many top-tier perks, drastically altering how both sides play. Dead Hard was nerfed, Ruin was toned down, Iron Will became less suppressive, and suddenly the power balance felt different. Behavior has stated their target is a 60% kill rate, roughly translating to a 40% escape rate. This doesn't mean every match should be 2 kills and 2 escapes, but rather an average that aims for fairness across the board. If we take a look at these escape rates and kill rates, you'll notice that the kill rates, while are drastically high and it feels like you don't escape many of your games, take a look at how many games are actually portioned for these kill rates. And if you take a look at the escape rates, look at the same thing. The amount of games that differ between the two are drastically different. While survivors may only have a 40% escape rate, they play drastically more games, whereas killers play way less, netting them a much higher kill percent based on how each game goes in the smaller amount. Data has shown periods where killers were too strong, however, especially with the release of high mobility killers such as the Blight and/or the Nurse. Conversely, survivor-sided metas have emerged with strong Swifts, Survive with Friends, and gen-rushing strategies. Throughout the years, every chapter release brings new balance changes. The introduction of killers, like the Artist and Skull Merchant, trigger community debates on camping, tunneling, and slowdown metas. These killers often shifted the kill rates upward, prompting nerfs and map changes. Meanwhile, some survivors and their perks, like Michaela's Boon Circle of Healing, gave survivors new defensive strategies. Ask 5 different players, you might get 5 different answers. Solo queue survivors often feel hopeless against coordinated killers. Killers complain about Swifts with perfect coordination and voice comms. There are many things that surround all these debates. There are many things that are talked about when it comes to a lot of these, such as how people will point out that Michaela's Boon Circle of Healing was actually in the game for almost a year or two, as strong as it was back in the day, compared to where a lot of the 3-genning metas were almost immediately taken out within a couple months. Now, a lot of people in the community, such as streamers and high competitive players, and even some of the base players of the game, highlight different pain points. However, the consensus in the community overall is that it's really difficult to decide whether it's killer-sided or survivor-sided, as balancing is a moving target in Dead by Daylight. In 2025, the balance discussion continues. With each patch, Behavior aims to address certain concerns, nurse overpowered strategies, and keep gameplay fresh. Whether you feel the game favors the killer or the survivor often depends on your role, your MMR, and the match itself. But one thing remains true: Dead by Daylight thrives on this tension. A lot of people nowadays would argue that the game is survivor-sided, for example, such as on the killer side. However, it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly how the game could be survivor-sided. Here's an example. If you look at old Dead by Daylight, we used to have infinite windows, we used to have poor laggy connections, we used to have really poor performance in the game, we used to have really bad hitboxes, we used to have old Self-Care, we used to have old Will Make It, we used to have old Decisive Strike, we used to have old Ruin, we used to have old Dead Hard, we used to have a lot of different things in the game that made the game feel either unplayable or in a really weird spot. Killers definitely back in the day struggled a lot more than survivors did. But that's not to say that with each chapter release, the game has shifted a little bit differently. Killers have definitely gotten it a little bit easier depending on the meta that is at play. To pinpoint a lot of the big problems that people would like to talk about when it comes to things like slugging, tunneling, and overall just the more unfun aspects of the game when it comes to killer-sided gameplay, a survivor will argue that it's killer-sided because it's not hard for them to be able to force a game in a situation where the survivors have to slow down what they're doing to win the game, making it easier for the killer to win the game. However, an argument can be said for every single point on either side. If you want to cancel down healing, because healing seems to be the biggest thing you struggle with on Killer, you can bring things like Gift of Pain, you can bring things like Sloppy Butcher. There's a lot of slowdown perks in the game that actually warrant you to be able to stop healing as a main issue, especially if you see a Swift bring a lot of medkits. There is still the ability to bring Franklin's as well if you want to counter items such as that nature. If we take a look at one of the perks such as Choleraphobia, by the way, it nowadays slows down the healing drastically comparative to how it used to just speed up the skill check, making it harder to heal people. However, a perk that is 100% reliant on skill checks is always situational at best. Hence why Autodidact, being considered the strongest healing perk for survivors, is also seen as situational and not as good. However, stacking skill checks on Autodidact is not nearly as difficult. Back in old Dead by Daylight, Dead Hard used to give you a severe amount of distance, and it also would take away your hitbox. It would give you like slight iframes, which you would be able to make a tile, you'd be able to make a window, you'd be able to make a pallet, all with just hitting one singular button. Nowadays, you have to be very ping reliant and you have to be very well timed with Dead Hard to even get it to work. But would a killer still complain that somebody has Dead Hard? Would survivors still think that Dead Hard is still super strong? Of course. Because anything that can give you an extra health state is considered strong, because it's the only thing that you have that gives you a second chance. There's a lot of things in the game that allow both sides to deter each other from being able to progress any further, such as killers having Pain Res, Pop Goes the Weasel, Eruption, Call of Brine. We even have perks that do base slowdowns such as Ruin, and we even have things like Grim Embrace and Deadlock. A lot of these perk combinations for Killer are what help them slow down the game, allowing them to progress the game a little bit further, a little bit easier for them. We even have endgame perks like Fire Up, No-Ed, and No Way Out, which allow a much easier endgame if you struggle with the early game. A lot of newer killers will run perks such as this because it makes it easier for them to be able to win the game even if they're losing really hard. However, that does not necessarily mean that they are going to be guaranteed the win every single time, such as No-Ed is able to be found and taken out. No Way Out can be procced immediately, and depending on how many hook states the killer might have, it's going to be completely useless, or it's going to last a long time, allowing the killer to add some pressure. On the survivor side of things, it's very different. A lot of the perks that used to be completely overpowered are a little bit different, and they have been nerfed and or changed. A good prime example that has been talked about throughout the years and has been one of the biggest points of Dead by Daylight is the perk Decisive Strike. Back in the day, you used to be able to use Decisive Strike at any point in the game. It didn't matter if it was early in the game, your first hook, second hook, third hook, it didn't even matter if the exit gates were open. You were able to use it at any point in the game. However, you were only able to use it once, and it was only a 3 or 4 second stun. It wasn't as incredible as people thought it was. However, it did allow you a chance every time you would get picked up. This then defaulted a meta where killers would dribble you to try to get you to a hook. Now, a killer learning how to counteract Decisive Strike, does that mean Decisive Strike was overpowered, or does that mean that killers have an easier time now because they can do that? Well, you gotta think about this and remember that every time a killer dropped you and picked you back up, your wiggle progress would increase. Now, nowadays, it's a lot more than it used to be. However, back in the day, it would still go up. And if a killer tried to dribble you too far, they would still drop you. You would still wiggle. So it's almost like your Decisive Strike actually still worked, but it was a little bit more difficult for the killer because they would have to go out of their way to try to carry you to a hook while worrying about your DS. So it was more of the fact that they were more concerned about you possibly having it than the possible chance of you actually using it. All in all, the kill rates for killers with the new chapter of Kaneki's release with the Tokyo Ghoul series is extremely high. If you look at the kill rates now, as we've showed before, killers have an extremely high kill rate right now. But that's because you're going to see the same meta builds over and over and over again, and that's because these are the builds that make it easier for killers to win the game. Such as you will see survivors bringing the exact same builds every single game because it makes it easier for them to win the game. Now we're going to talk about the Swift versus solo queue side of things. There's a lot of different things in the game that make it really easy for survivors to win, but it also is still very complicated depending on how you play. I find it oddly suspicious and strange that a Swift, a full 4-man team with communication, could still get 4K'd. Yet, the very next game, a killer will complain that they went up against a Swift that 4-outed them and they never got a single kill. Does this mean that the Swift was super strong? Does this mean that the killer was super weak? Does this mean the map they were playing on was super broken? It's really hard to differentiate the difference between what is strong, what isn't strong, how good somebody is, depending on how it's played. You run into metas like the slowdown meta where there was the gen kick meta, which was extremely slow and boring for everybody. This is when 3 gens were extremely prominent, and people would argue that this was heavily killer-sided because all they had to do was keep the 3 gen forever. However, there were perks and there were playstyles that initiated the ability to separate the 3 gen, and there were always ways to counteract 3 genning. You had Deja Vu, which has been in the game forever. So all you had to do if you were playing with a Swift was call out the 3 gen and just break the 3 gen throughout the whole game. Then the argument would come out, but what if the killer was playing for the 3 gen? They only stuck by the 3 gen. And this is where the argument comes in that survivors have a hard time against killer because they don't know how to properly navigate the killer and making it easier for them to win the game. I know everything that I've probably said over the course of this so far has sounded like a bunch of yapping and gibberish, but I will tell you, to make it a lot simpler, is that over the course of all the chapters and the years of Dead by Daylight, a lot of metas have shifted, a lot of perk changes have happened, and a lot of different ways of play have come about. To iterate on the idea of slugging, there are perks to counteract slugging. While not the best or most ideal, we do have perks like Unbreakable, which is a one-time use where you can pick yourself up. We do have perks like Soul Guard, which is where if you're affected by a hex, or if you use Unbreakable, or if you're picked up by somebody else, you get Endurance from the dying state. And a fun little side note about Soul Guard, if you're affected by a hex, you can pick yourself up infinitely, such as if you had no Mither. Speaking of no Mither, that is another anti-slug perk. However, there's a good chance that when the killer sees you have no Mither, they're probably just going to insta-pick you anyway because they know for a fact that no Mither is a guaranteed pickup regardless. You have perks like We're Gonna Live Forever, where if you have a teammate who even has 2 brain cells in their head, they would know to go pick up a down survivor as long as the killer is not nearby. However, you could also say that the killer would be hovering the slug, right? If the killer is hovering the slug, that is when your team should be applying pressure. It takes roughly 4 or 5 minutes to bleed out on the ground, which gives your team plenty of time to get gens done. And while you might be afraid for that one survivor's life and how it might be not fun for the survivor on the ground, again, there are many countermeasures to slugging, and even if the killer is watching the slug, take that time to win the game. The killer just threw the game because they wanted to watch somebody sit on the floor for 4.5 minutes, you know? Then people will argue that killers just tunnel constantly, and how tunneling is a big pain point problem for the game. But here's the thing, there are also countermeasures to that too. There's Off the Record, there's Decisive Strike, there's Dead Hard, there's Hit Takes with either Medal of Man, Strong Medkits, Anti-Hems. There's a lot of second chance perks that allow tunneling to not be a problem. However, survivors will always complain that when they're getting tunneled, that's the best that they have because they can only use certain things so much. Such as how Decisive Strike is no longer a use at any time in the game, you can only use it after you've been hooked and you can only use it once. And once the exit gates are powered, you can no longer use it. However, this is where I argue out that you have Off the Record. Off the Record is 80 seconds where you are a lot quieter. If I remember correctly, you also leave no pools of blood with Off the Record, but I could be wrong about that. But you have 80 seconds worth of endurance. Now, there's the double-edged sword to that. Off the Record may give you 80 seconds worth of endurance, which is where when you get unhooked, you have that, mending timer where if the killer hits you off hook again, you have that 10 seconds to not go down. Off the Record gives you 80. But if you do anything, and I quite literally mean anything, if you touch a generator, if you heal somebody, if you interact with something, that endurance goes away, making off the record almost completely useless. So then people will be like, well, the only real way you're going to get value out of it is if you take the 80 seconds to annoy the killer. But by that point, you've already chosen to either be tunneled or to not stealth your way with off the record to go get healed up. On the survivor side of things, it is very difficult to be able to determine whether it is killer-sided or not, because there's a lot of different countermeasures to how killers can play. While annoying, yes, extremely annoying. Slugging is not fun. If anything, slugging is my most hated playstyle that a killer can pick, because I do not like the idea of laying on the ground for 4 or 5 minutes not being able to play the game. It is annoying and frustrating, but there are countermeasures to it. The same thing will be said for the survivor side of things. A killer will complain that a survivor has everything at their disposal to make their job extremely difficult. While that may be true, that is the only thing survivors can have to be able to counteract a killer. Granted, I will say that I am kind of okay with the idea that killers have it slightly easier nowadays than they used to, but that's only because there were quite a few years where killers were struggling really hard because survivor perks were so strong. Medkits back in the day used to have way more charges, they used to heal way quicker, and anti-hems used to be instant heals. Like, I know we still call them insta-heals today, but there is a 16-second timer nowadays where that goes off. Whereas back in the day, the instant you popped it, you were full healed right then and there. There was no 16-second timer. A killer could argue that you have bully squads, such as breakout, sabo toolboxes, flashbang, flashlight saves. You got the people who are really good at looping really strong tiles. But I can say from personal experience that whether you're playing killer or survivor, it doesn't really matter if you're looping a strong tile, if you have a flashlight, if you're going for saves, if you're going for background play saves, if you're going for the breakout saves and all that kind of stuff. It really doesn't matter, because 9 times out of 10 it comes down to skill, game knowledge, and how you play around those perks. Just because somebody has breakout doesn't mean you're not going to make it to a hook. Just because somebody has a sabo toolbox doesn't mean that you don't have 2 hooks next to each other. Just because somebody has a flashlight doesn't mean they'll always get the save. Something as simple as Lightborn or looking at the wall will completely counteract that playstyle altogether, completely wiping one of the most played playstyles in the entire game, especially when it comes to bully squads. Again, I can point out how frustrating it is to go against Swifts like this. It is not fun. There is no point in any argument that I'm stating here where any of these playstyles are fun to go against. However, the argument that we've been talking about this whole time isn't whether the game and the way it's played is fun or not. It's about whether it is survivor-sided or killer-sided, meaning is it more in the favor of a killer or more in the favor of a survivor. To kind of end on a high note on my personal opinion on the matter, because I think I talked about everything that I can. The video was kind of all over the place because as much as I did my research and also tried to piece together a nice little script, I'm kind of an idiot and I don't really care all that much, because as I'm about to point out my opinion on the matter, I don't really believe the game is killer-sided or survivor-sided. I genuinely believe the game comes down to how good you are at playing certain maps against certain playstyles, if you're prepared for the playstyles, and your overall skill level. Because unfortunately, one of the biggest points of the game is being able to loop the killer. And a lot of people don't know how to run the super strong tiles. Just because there are strong tiles in the game doesn't mean people know how to loop them correctly. How many times do you go into a solo queue game and your random teammates will go down in 10 seconds? And you'll be like, oh, they were at the strongest jungle gym in the game, or oh, they were on one of the strongest fillers in the game and they still went down in like 5 seconds. Like if the loop was up so strong, like why did they go down so fast? Was the killer just that good? Was the game so killer-sided that they couldn't play that super strong tile correctly? I don't think so. I think the survivor either wasn't as good or the killer was just better. It comes down to personal skill at the end of the day. And it also comes down to the idea that whether you're playing with a Swift with comms, which does make it easier for Swifts, or whether you're playing killer and you have one of the strongest meta builds of all time, if you don't know how to play the character through their power, or if you, as a Swift, aren't very good at communicating and you're just trying to have a good time and maybe mess with the killer, there's a good chance you're not going to survive. A lot of people forget that a lot of Swifts nowadays are just trying to have fun, like, you know, and annoy the killer. Granted, while annoying the killer still gets the 4K. Why is that? Well, because the Swift isn't really doing gens. They just want to have fun. Now granted, there are the bully squads where they'll bully the holy hell out of the killer and do the gens. Those, unfortunately, are the unfun ones to play against. But then again, as I said, the killer has way more strategies that are extremely unfun for survivors to play against. But every playstyle in the game has its own countermeasures, granted whether it's strong or not. As unfortunate as it is to say, I do believe that survivors actually do kind of have it a little easier, because if you do play with a Swift, you can communicate, and if your communication is fine and you know what you're doing, the game isn't that hard. You just have to be semi-decent against most of the powers in the game and some of the killers that aren't really that hard to play against, because if you think about it, a lot of the killers in the game are basic M1 killers. You have a lot of range, stealth, and mobility killers, but most of them are either M1 killers or they have a very unique power that has a certain way that you need to play around it. To summarize this, the game has many meta shifts, has many perk styles and combinations, and many different things that could argue both sides. And I'm not sitting here saying that the game, that you shouldn't see it as killer-sided or survivor-sided. I'm just saying, in my opinion, I don't think it's either, personally. While there are things that favor killers such as maps, perk combinations, and playstyles, and survivors have swifts, comms, and a bunch of other like really strong perks that can make the killer's life a complete living nightmare, I don't think it's either. Because you gotta think about the situation. Just because the killer 4K'd in one game doesn't mean they're gonna do it in the next. Just because the survivors got out a 4-man out in one game doesn't mean they're gonna do it the next. I hope I was able to shed some light or perspective on the matter on whether the game is killer-sided or survivor-sided. It's really difficult to say which it is, at least in my opinion, but let me know what you think. Let me know what your opinions are. If you think the game is killer-sided, let me know why. If you think the game is survivor-sided, let me know why. If you kind of understand where I'm coming from, where I don't think it's either, then let me know down below, and maybe perspectives can change, discussions can happen, and I would love to hear about it. I'm also completely sorry that I had like 50 strokes in this video and I sounded like I was talking about complete nonsense the whole time, but I hope that you guys were able to keep up. Thank you for watching, and I hope the discussion helped.